Before you press play, I need you to stay with me for just a moment. There's a kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive on a white horse or in a bouquet of flowers left at your door. It arrives in the smell of wood smoke and black coffee at 5 in the morning. It arrives in the sound of someone humming a song you didn't know you needed to hear. It arrives when you're not looking, when you're too tired and too broken and too busy surviving to notice that someone has quietly, without permission, become the most important part of your day. I've kept a ledger my whole life. Not just the ranch ledger, cattle counts, feed costs, dry seasons tallied against wet ones. I mean an internal ledger, a private accounting of what I owe the world and what the world owes me. My father taught me to write everything down. If it ain't on paper, it didn't happen, he used to say, and I believed him. I wrote down the year the drought took 40 head of cattle. I wrote down the morning my father died with his boots still on. I wrote down every hard season this land ever handed me. But I never wrote down the morning Clara Redhorse walked through my kitchen door with a cast iron skillet in one hand and a jar of dried sage in the other, looking at the state of my stove like it had personally offended her. I didn't write it down because I didn't think it mattered. I was wrong about a lot of things that year. This is the story I should have put in the ledger from the very first day. The morning she arrived, I was arguing with a fence post. Not metaphorically. Literally standing in the north pasture at 6:30, jaw set, both hands wrapped around a cedar post that had heaved itself 3 inches out of the ground overnight, trying to reason with it through sheer stubbornness, because I didn't have the energy for anything more complicated than stubbornness. My foreman, Deke, had quit 2 weeks prior, took his hat, his truck, and my best border collie without so much as a note. My seasonal hands wouldn't arrive until the first week of April. And the cattle, 17 of them, had pushed through the gap in the east fence the previous afternoon, and had spent the night grazing on my neighbor Harlan Buell's winter wheat. Harlan was not pleased. I had paid him $70 I didn't have, and apologized with a handshake that cost me considerably more in pride. So I was in the pasture talking to a fence post when I heard a truck I didn't recognize come up the gravel drive. Old Ford. Blue once before the sun got to it. I watched it from across the field, not moving, waiting to see who climbed out. A woman, medium height, dark braid down her back, going silver at the temples. She wore a canvas work jacket the color of creek mud and carried 2 cloth bags that looked heavy. She stood beside her truck, looked at the house, then looked out across the field and found me without any apparent difficulty, like she'd been calibrating to my exact location for years. She raised a hand, not a wave, more of an acknowledgement. The kind of gesture that says, I see you and I'm not impressed, but I'll be civil about it. I walked back across the field. Her name was Clara Redhorse. She was Apache Hikaria, she'd later tell me, from a family that had ranched and worked land in this territory long before anyone thought to put fences on it. She was 44 years old, recently widowed, and she had driven 61 miles from Cimarron after seeing my handwritten notice pinned to the board outside the feed store in town. Ranch cook wanted, room and board plus wage. No nonsense. She stood in my kitchen, looked at the stove and said, "When did you last clean this?" I said, "It works fine." She set her bags on the table and opened one, dried sage, dried chili, a bundle of something I didn't recognize. A coffee tin that turned out to contain a sourdough starter she'd been keeping alive for 11 years. "I'll need a week to get the kitchen right," she said. It wasn't a request. I told her the wage. She didn't flinch, which meant it was either fair or she needed it badly enough not to negotiate, and I didn't know her well enough yet to know which. She took the room at the back of the house, a small room off the pantry that had been used for storage since my mother passed, and by noon she had stripped the shelving and opened the window, and the whole south side of the house smelled like sage and cedar, and something else I couldn't name. Something that made the house feel, for the first time in a long time, like somewhere a person actually lived. I wrote in my ledger that evening, hired a cook, See, Red Horse seems capable, doesn't talk much, good. I was a fool. She was up before me every morning. I prided myself on early rising. 4:30 was my standard, the stars still hard and cold above the mesa, and every morning I came down those stairs to find the stove already lit, the coffee already made, and Clara already present, either working at the counter or sitting at the table with a cup in both hands, looking out the east window at the dark. She never seemed surprised to see me. She never said good morning like it was a greeting. She said it like a statement of fact, good morning, as in, this morning is demonstrably good, arguable but fine. She cooked like someone who had been feeding people through hard seasons her entire life. Not fancy, not showy, but there was a precision to it, a knowledge of what a man needed after 6 hours of physical work in cold wind. Biscuits that were dense enough to hold you until noon. Red chili stew with enough heat to keep your blood moving. Coffee strong enough to constitute a personal confrontation with consciousness. She kept track of what I liked and what I avoided without ever asking. I didn't notice her doing it. I just noticed, after 2 weeks, that the things I pushed around my plate had quietly stopped appearing. The hands arrived in April. 6 men, 4 I'd worked with before, 2 new. She fed all of them without complaint and without adjustment to her schedule, simply expanded the quantities with a calm that made the operation look effortless. The men liked her immediately, in the uncomplicated way working men like someone who feeds them well and doesn't require anything of them emotionally. They called her Miss Clara. She called them by their last names, and occasionally, when one of them did something particularly stupid, by a look that required no words at all. I watched her with them and felt something I couldn't account for in the ledger. Not jealousy exactly, something more like attention, a heightened noticing. The way she moved through the kitchen was economical, no wasted motion, but there was a grace in it too, something that came from long practice and a deep, internal knowledge of space. She never bumped into anything. She never dropped anything. She always knew where her hands were. My mother used to say that you could learn everything about a person by watching how they moved in a kitchen. I was starting to understand what she meant. It was a Tuesday in late April when I first understood that something had shifted in me that I hadn't planned for and wasn't sure I could account for. I'd come in from the south pasture after a fence repair that had taken 4 hours longer than it should have because the ground was still frozen 6 inches down, and the post driver kept bouncing off the clay like an insult. My hands were raw. I had a cut on my left palm from a snapped wire that I'd wrapped with my bandana and ignored. My back was making arguments that I wasn't in a position to answer. Clara was at the stove. She didn't turn around when I came in, but she said, "Sit down," the way she said most things, not a request, not a command, just the logical conclusion of observable data. I sat. She turned, saw my hand, and set down the wooden spoon without a word. She went to the cabinet where she kept a tin of salve she'd brought with her, something she made herself. She'd mentioned once, beeswax and something I didn't know the name of, and she came to the table, sat across from me, and held out her hand. I gave her mine. She unwrapped the bandana with careful fingers, looked at the cut. It wasn't deep, ugly, but not dangerous. She cleaned it with a dampened cloth and then opened the tin and worked the salve in with her thumb, and I sat there across the kitchen table from her and felt, with sudden and unnerving clarity, that I had not been this close to another person in a very long time. She was focused on my hand. Her braid had come slightly loose, and one dark silver strand had fallen forward across her cheek, and she hadn't moved it. Her thumb was methodical, careful, working in slow circles that were warmer than I expected and firmer than I needed, and I genuinely could not look away from her face. She looked up, found me looking. Neither of us said anything for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. Then she folded the clean bandana and wrapped my hand and tucked the end under with 2 fingers and sat back. "Don't use that hand for fence work for 3 days, she said. "I've got 3 days, she said, and went back to the stove. I sat at the table for another minute doing nothing, which was not something I did. Then I opened my ledger and picked up my pencil and sat there with the point touching the paper and couldn't think of a single thing to write that would be accurate. I wrote hand cut, repaired, and then I sat there a while longer, because even I knew that wasn't the truth of what had happened at that table. The thing about loneliness, the specific, grinding kind that comes from years of it, from choosing work over everything else until everything else stops being an option, is that it becomes a kind of background frequency. You stop hearing it the way you stop hearing the wind. It's just there, constant, part of the texture of the day. Clara didn't fix my loneliness. That's not what happened. What happened was that she reminded me I was lonely, which sounds like a cruelty, but it wasn't. It was more like having a window opened in a room you'd forgotten was a room. The cold air comes in. You feel the cold, but you also feel the air. I started finding reasons to come in early. Not by much, 15 minutes, sometimes 20. Enough to sit at the table with my coffee while she was still cooking before the hands came in and the noise began. She didn't ask why I was early. She didn't comment on it. She just continued, cooked, moved around the kitchen. Occasionally said something without preamble that I was expected to have context for, and usually did, because we had apparently been having a long, slow, continuous conversation that neither of us had announced. One morning she told me, without being asked, that her husband had died of a heart attack in November, clearing snow from the truck. 11 years of marriage, no children. His family had not been, she paused, found the word generous in the aftermath. She'd sold the small house and most of what was in it, and driven south with her 2 bags and her sourdough starter, and her knowledge of how to feed people through hard seasons. She said all of this looking out the east window, the same way she said most personal things, as if the information was meant for the distance and I was merely in the vicinity. I didn't say I was sorry. It seemed inadequate. I didn't say anything for a while. Then I said, my father always said that land stays and people go. He thought that was a comfort. I always thought it was the saddest thing I'd ever heard. She looked at me then, a look I hadn't seen from her before, not evaluation, something quieter. Yeah, she said after a moment, me too. That was all. But I wrote in the ledger that night, told me about her husband. I told her what my father said. She understood what I meant. And then I sat there and realized I had been alone on this ranch for 9 years, and in 9 years I had never written down a conversation. May came in wet and argumentative. 3 inches of rain in the first week, which sounds like a blessing in ranch country and would have been, except that the creek that ran along the north boundary jumped its bank on the 5th day and took out a section of the lower fence and deposited a significant portion of the neighboring timber into my east pasture, which the cattle then decided was their personal enrichment program. I spent 4 days in mud to my ankles, working alongside 2 hands and a borrowed tractor, and by the time the pasture was clear, I had developed a cough that Clara monitored with the focused disapproval of someone who has seen ranch men ignore things until they became problems. She made a tea I didn't ask for and put it in front of me every evening. It tasted like pine needles and stubbornness. I drank it. What's in this? I said on the 3rd evening. Things that work, she said, not looking up from the pot she was tending. That's not an answer. You're getting better, she said, which was also not an answer but was accurate. There was a rhythm to us by May. I felt it the way you feel a current in a river, not seeing it exactly, but knowing it's there, knowing the water is moving in a direction and that you are moving with it. We ate our early morning meal alone together. We ate evening meals with the hands. She had started leaving a lamp on in the kitchen if I came in late, which she said was because she forgot to turn it off, and I said nothing because some fictions are worth maintaining. I told her things I hadn't told anyone, Not in long confessionals, neither of us operated that way, but in pieces over weeks, the way you add entries to a ledger. I told her about the drought year, about my father, about the morning I had stood in the north pasture, and genuinely not known whether I could keep going or whether I even wanted to, and how it had been the cattle themselves, the simple, uncomplicated physical need of them, that had pulled me forward. She listened the way she did everything else, with a stillness that was not emptiness, full attention that didn't perform itself. She told me things too, about her mother, who had known every medicinal plant in the territory and taught her their uses on long walks when she was small, about the specific grief of a marriage that was good, not perfect, not easy, but good, and how losing something good is different from losing something difficult, how there's no complicated relief in it, just the absence. She told me about the year she had cooked for a hunting camp in the mountains and had become, accidentally, deeply attached to a dog that didn't belong to her, and had thought about that dog for years afterward. She said it with the same tone she used for everything, but her hands had slowed on whatever she was doing, and I knew it was not a small thing. I had not known, before Clara, that intimacy could be primarily logistical, that two people could become close through the shared management of a working day, through the accumulated weight of small exchanges, through the way someone hands you coffee and the specific angle of that handoff changes, imperceptibly over weeks, until you realize the gesture means something it didn't mean before. The kiss happened on a Thursday. I want to be clear about that because it matters not the day but the ordinariness of the day. It was not a dramatic evening. There was no storm, no crisis, no cinematic lighting. It was a Thursday in mid-May, and I had come in from mending the creek fence, and she was standing at the counter cutting dried apricots for something she was making for the weekend, and the lamp was on, and the kitchen smelled like apricots and wood smoke, and that particular Clara smell that I had never isolated into components. But that meant, simply, home in a way the house had not meant home in years. I came in, she looked up, she said, "Creek fence." "Done," I said. "Good," she went back to the apricots. Then she said, without looking up, "You've been making excuses to be in here earlier." I stopped with my jacket half off. She kept cutting. "I'm aware," I said finally. "I know you are." She set down the knife and turned around and looked at me with that direct, unperformed attention that still, after 2 months, hit me somewhere in the chest. "I've been leaving the lamp on," she said, "not because I forget." We looked at each other across the kitchen. I don't know which of us moved first. I'm not sure it matters. What I know is that I crossed the kitchen and she met me somewhere in the middle, and when I kissed her it was not tentative, not desperate either. It was the kiss of two people who have been moving towards something at a measured pace and have finally arrived, and both of them know it. She put one hand against my chest. I thought she was stopping me. She wasn't. She was feeling my heartbeat. She said so later. She said she needed to know if I was scared. I was, terribly, but my heart was also going at a pace that had nothing to do with fear. She pulled back first, looked up at me. Her braid was loose again, that same strand against her cheek. "This changes things," she said. "I know." "I'm not," she stopped, started again. "I work here, Callan." She had never used my name before. In 2 months, it had always been nothing, or a gesture, or you. I heard my name in her voice and it rearranged something in my chest. "You do," I said. "And that's complicated, and I don't know how to do this, and I haven't. It's been a long time since I didn't know how to do something." She looked at me for a long moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, something smaller and more honest than a smile. "I haven't either," she said. "I want to tell you it was easy after that. It wasn't. The complications were real, and they arrived the following morning with perfect punctuality. I came downstairs at 4:30, and Clara was at the stove, and the hands would arrive at 5:30, and the question of what we were, and what that meant in the context of this ranch and her employment, and the opinions of 6 working men who would notice anything that changed, because working men always notice, sat between us at the kitchen table like a document waiting to be signed. We didn't talk about it that morning. We drank coffee. She made eggs. At some point her hand rested on the table, not close to mine, but near, and I set my hand next to hers, not touching, just present. That was enough for that morning. The complications had other opinions. 2 of the hands noticed within a week. I know because I saw Tommy Rios say something to big-shouldered Garrett Fife near the barn and saw Garrett look toward the house and then back and shrug. And Garrett's shrug was a philosophical gesture that meant not my business, and also I have opinions about this that I will not share. I appreciated Garrett. Tommy Rios left his biscuit plate particularly clean that week, and I chose to interpret this as approval. The harder conversation was the internal one, because the ledger in my head, that private accounting I'd kept for 46 years, kept raising objections. She was employed here. What happened if this didn't work? What happened to her, practically, if things went wrong between us? She had come to this ranch because she needed something stable, and I was proposing to make her stability contingent on something as unstable as 2 lonely people deciding they might be in love. The power difference was real. The risk was hers more than mine. I knew it, and it kept me awake, and I didn't know what the right answer was. I told her this, directly, sitting on the porch after the hands had turned in, the night sounds coming in from the pasture, the stars doing what they do over high desert, which is to say everything. She listened without interrupting, which was her way. Then she said, "You think I haven't thought about it? I know you have. I'm 52, not 22, she said. I've buried a husband, I've started over twice. I know what risk looks like. I've chosen riskier things with less. That doesn't make it not risky." "No," she said, "it doesn't." She was quiet for a moment. "But you are." She stopped, looked out at the dark. "You're a good man, Callan. I knew it before I wanted to know it. I've been paying attention for 2 months. I said, "I've been paying attention for 2 months too." "I know," she said. "You made it obvious." "I did not." She looked at me sideways. "You came in 20 minutes early every morning for 6 weeks. 15, I said. 20, she said. We sat on that porch for a long time. The night was cold, and neither of us moved inside. At some point she pulled her jacket tighter, and at some point after that I put my arm around her, and she leaned into it with a naturalness that made the whole architecture of the previous 2 months suddenly make sense. Every early morning, every lamp left on, every hand held briefly across a kitchen table. It had all been building to the specific weight and warmth of her against my side in the dark. I had not been this warm in years. I thought about writing it in the ledger, the exact weight of it, the cold air and the warm shoulder and the sound of the cattle moving in the dark pasture and the feeling of I didn't have the word for it. I still don't. Not happiness exactly. Something more honest than happiness. Something that acknowledged the risk and the complication and the grief both of us were carrying and existed anyway, on the other side of all of it, quiet and improbable and real. I didn't write it in the ledger that night. Some things I was beginning to understand are not meant to be accounted for. June arrived the way June does in high desert country, sudden and uncompromising, the temperature swinging 30 degrees between dawn and midday, the sky doing complicated things by afternoon that you learn to read if you plan to survive out here. My father had been able to tell a hail storm from a rain storm by the color of the southern clouds. I'd never quite mastered it. Clara, it turned out, could read that sky the same way my father had, and I didn't ask how she'd learned because some knowledge is inherited and some is carried, and neither kind requires explanation. She told me to move the horses in from the east pasture on a Tuesday afternoon, when the sky was still technically clear. I did it without arguing, which Tommy Rios witnessed, and which I believe he told Garrett Fife about later, because that evening Garrett looked at me with an expression that combined respect and amusement in approximately equal proportions. The hail came at 4 o'clock, golf ball sized. The east pasture fence took damage. The horses were fine. "How did you know?" I asked her that evening. "The air smelled like iron," she said. "An hour before." I didn't know what to do with that except decide to start paying attention to what iron smelled like. The summer was the hardest I'd had in years, and the best. Those two things coexisted without resolving each other, which is something I had not previously understood was possible. The hard parts. The well pump failed in early June, and the repair cost me 3 weeks of operating margin. One of the hands, young Alvarez, broke 2 fingers on the same hand in a roping accident and was out for 6 weeks. The hay yield was down 20% from the prior year. I had a running dispute with a Bureau of Land Management administrator over grazing permits that consumed more of my attention than anything worth that much of my attention, and which Clara observed from a moderate distance with an expression that I eventually identified as recognition. She had seen land disputes before, knew what they cost, and was deciding whether to say so. She said so one evening, not diplomatically. She told me that the land I was fighting for was land her grandfather's grandfather had known under different names and different arrangements, and that she had watched 3 generations of men exhaust themselves over boundaries, and that the cattle didn't care whose name was on the permit as long as the grass was good. I sat with that for a while. "You think I should let it go?" I said. "I think you should decide what you're actually fighting for," she said, "because it might not be the pasture." It wasn't the pasture. I'd known that. It was the principle, the accumulation of small administrative dismissals over years, the feeling of being managed and moved around my own land. She had named it without flattering it, and after a week I filed the paperwork, made the compromise, and let the administrator have the minor victory he'd been angling for. It cost me 11 acres of summer grazing that I could work around. It cost me considerably less than the fight would have. I wrote in the ledger, settled BLM dispute. C was right, she usually is. The good parts were quieter than the hard parts, the way good parts usually are. We fell into a life that was ours in a way that had not been planned or negotiated. She still cooked. That had not changed. It was work she was paid for and work she had her own pride about, and nobody, including me, was going to interfere with the architecture of her kitchen. But the nature of it had changed. I was not a boss eating in his own house. We were 2 people sharing a space they had both, over months, made into something neither of them had expected. She brought plants into the kitchen. Herbs I didn't know the names of, small clay pots lined up on the south windowsill, which she tended in the mornings before the cooking started. The kitchen smelled different with them there, more alive. Somehow, like the room had a lung it had previously been missing. She taught me to make coffee the way she made it. Not the brew, the process, the specific attention she brought to it. The way she treated it as the first intentional act of the day rather than a mechanical response to the alarm. I had been making coffee for 30 years, and she managed to make it feel like I'd been doing it wrong, not technically, but spiritually, which is not a word I use, but it's the accurate one. I started paying attention to what iron smelled like. Sometimes I got it right. There were hard conversations we had to have, and we had them badly, the way people do. Twice we had arguments that left the evening meal silent and the lamp off and me sitting in the barn longer than the work required. Once she went to her truck and I thought she was leaving, and I stood on the porch and felt the particular terror of watching someone take the possibility of warmth away from you, and realized I was not, as I had told myself for years, a man who had made his peace with solitude. I had merely run out of alternatives. She didn't leave. She drove to the end of the gravel drive and back. She told me later that she needed to know the road was still there if she chose it, and that knowing it was there made it easier to stay. I understood that more than I had any right to. The argument that had put her in the truck was about her mother. Clara's mother was 78 years old, living with Clara's brother in Cimarron, and her health was declining in the way of someone who has spent decades being competent and is finding competence no longer sufficient against time. Clara drove the 61 miles once a week, sometimes twice. I had said something on a Tuesday evening, not cruel, but careless, something about schedules and the hands needing breakfast at the right time, and the sentence had barely finished before I knew I'd said the wrong thing, and the way Clara set down the dish she was holding told me she knew it too. She didn't raise her voice. Clara rarely raised her voice. She said, "I will drive to see my mother as many times as I choose," in the tone that required no amplification, and then she put on her coat and went to the truck. When she came back, I was waiting on the porch. "I'm sorry," I said before she reached the steps. She looked at me in the dark. "I know," she said. "I need you to understand that there are things I will not renegotiate, not for this ranch, not for any arrangement." "I know," I said. "I didn't mean I wasn't asking you to." "You were," she said, "without meaning to, which is how those things usually work." She was right. I had been, without meaning to, managing her time like it was mine to manage because she worked here. That was the old habit asserting itself, the habit of the boss, the habit of a man who had run this place alone for so long that he'd stopped clearly seeing where the operation ended and the person began. It was not a small thing to untangle, and I knew it, and I stood on that porch and felt the difficulty of it. How loving someone does not automatically revise your reflexes. How you can mean well and still reproduce the structures you inherited. "I'm going to get that wrong again," I said, "probably more than once." "Yes," she said, "so will I." She came up the steps, stopped beside me. "But I'd rather get it wrong with someone who tells me when I'm wrong." "You do that," I said, "better than anyone I've known." "It's a skill," she said, and went inside. I stood on the porch another minute. The sky was doing its summer things, heat lightning somewhere far south, the Milky Way running its route overhead like it had somewhere to be. I thought about what it costs to stay somewhere. Not the dramatic cost, not the crisis moments, not the truck at the end of the drive. The daily cost. The discipline of choosing, every day, to build something that could be damaged and deciding it was worth it anyway. My father had loved this land with that kind of discipline. He had stayed through every hard year because leaving had genuinely never occurred to him. Not stubbornness, I now thought, but a different kind of love. The kind that doesn't weigh its options. I wasn't sure I'd earned that kind of certainty yet. But I was beginning to understand what it looked like. In July, Clara's mother came to the ranch for a week. Her name was Delphine, and she was 78 years old and approximately 4 feet 11 inches. And when she came through the door of the house, she looked at the kitchen and then at me and said, in a voice that had no apparent volume setting below clear, "My daughter keeps your kitchen better than you deserve." "Yes, ma'am," I said. She approved of me by the third day, which I know because she told me, not subtly. She sat in the kitchen one afternoon while Clara was resting and said, "You look at her like she's something you found by accident that you're not willing to lose." I said, "That's about right." "Good," she said. "She's had enough people in her life who took what she offered and didn't look." She patted my hand once, the way a woman of her generation pats the hand of someone she has decided to tolerate, and went back to the something she was shelling. I sat there with my hand on the table and felt, with sudden and unexpected force, the weight of what Clara had come from, the specific inheritance of a woman who had been raised by someone like Delphine, who had been taught to know things and do things and persist through things, and who had arrived on my doorstep with 2 bags and a sourdough starter and an 11-year-old marriage's worth of grief, and had proceeded to make everything around her more alive. I had not been looking for her. She had not been looking for me. We had found each other the way most real things are found, sideways, while looking for something else, in the middle of a practical necessity. The last week of July, she asked me what I'd written in my ledger the morning after we kissed. I showed her. She looked at the entry, hand cut, repaired, and she laughed. The full kind, not the corner of mouth movement I'd gotten used to, but something larger and genuinely unguarded, and I realized I hadn't heard her laugh that way before, and that it was, without question, one of the better sounds I had encountered in 46 years on Earth. "That's what you wrote," she said. "It was a difficult moment to summarize," I said. She looked at the ledger. At the pages of it, the drought years, my father's death, the cattle counts and feed costs and dry seasons. A life in numbers and facts, compressed into the kind of language that leaves everything important out. She ran her finger down one page without reading it, thinking. "You should keep the ledger," she said. "I don't want you to stop." She looked up. "But some things don't belong in it. I know that now." She closed the ledger and pushed it across the table back to me. "What do you put those in?" I looked at her across the table, at the kitchen that smelled like her herbs and her sourdough, and the particular, irreplaceable quality of a space that had been breathed in and worked in and cared for by someone who knew how. "I'm still working that out," I said. She looked at me for a moment, then she picked up her coffee. "Good," she said. "I'll be here while you do. There are things I want to tell you about that fall, about the evening we sat on the porch when the first frost came, and she put her cold hand in my warm one and didn't say anything, and I didn't either, because there wasn't anything that needed saying. About the morning she made the first batch of sourdough biscuits, and Garrett Fife ate 4 of them, and made a sound that I can only describe as involuntary, and which Clara received with the contained satisfaction of someone who has known for a long time that she is very good at what she does. About the Sunday in October when she drove to Cimarron and came back late and quiet, and I knew before she said anything that her mother was worse, and I heated the stew she'd left on the stove and put it in front of her and sat across from her while she ate and didn't talk about it until she was ready, because that was something she'd taught me, how to be present without filling the space. About the morning I came downstairs, and for the first time in 6 months she wasn't up before me, and I stood in the kitchen and built the fire and started the coffee and did my best with the biscuits, which were not good, let me be clear. They were genuinely unfortunate biscuits, dense in the wrong way, uneven. One of them slightly scorched, and brought her a cup and set it on the small table beside her bed without waking her, and went back to the kitchen and waited. She came downstairs an hour later, saw the coffee things out, saw the biscuit pan, picked up one of the biscuits, looked at it, set it back down. "I appreciate the effort," she said. "They're bad," I said. "Yes," she said. "They really are." She poured herself coffee from the pot I'd made, which was also not good. I had gotten used to her making it and had apparently unlearned my own method, and sat across from me at the kitchen table, and we were quiet together in the particular way of 2 people who have stopped needing noise to fill the space between them. The lamp was on. The stove was going. Her herbs were on the windowsill doing whatever herbs do in early morning light. I did not open the ledger. Some mornings are not for accounting.